Before gold glittered in a king's hand, before the first coin rang against stone, there was already a financial system. It did not begin in a market, it began in memory. In southern Mesopotamia, more than 5,000 years ago, grain, labor, and obligation were being counted, long before money could be carried in the hand. The first great economic question was not, what is wealth? It was, how do we remember who owes what? The answer was not metal. It was wet clay, pressed by a reed into lines that outlived the people who made them. Before money became an object, it was a record. Before it became a coin, it was a promise. So let us return to the land where that promise first had to be measured, the river plains of Sumer, where abundance created a problem no village memory could carry for long. In the late 4th millennium BCE, on the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, southern Mesopotamia was becoming something the world had never seen before. Dense settlements, irrigation canals, temple households, and the first true cities. In places such as Uruk, fields of barley did more than feed families. They fed laborers, priests, herders, builders, and boatmen whose work no longer followed the rhythm of a single household. This was the beginning of scale. When harvests moved from field to storehouse, and from storehouse to workers' rations, the old village habit of remembering by face and voice began to fail. A spoken promise could travel only as far as a human witness. A growing city needed something stronger. It needed a way to hold obligations still after the speaker had gone silent. And that need did not begin with trade. It began with surplus. Surplus was the blessing that created the crisis. Once irrigation and organized labor made larger harvests possible, grain no longer passed only from hand to mouth. It had to be stored, guarded, measured, and redistributed across months and seasons. A temple household could receive barley after harvest, issue rations later, and expect labor in return long after the original delivery had faded from ordinary memory. In such a world, prosperity created delay, and delay created uncertainty. The richer the storehouse became, the more fragile memory became. A village could trust recollection. A city handling thousands of containers, workers, and obligations could not. This is why the earliest administrative problem of civilization was financial before it was philosophical. Not the invention of money as an object, but the control of claims across time. Once grain could sit in a warehouse far beyond the moment of harvest, one quiet question began to rule the city. Who could prove what had been placed inside? Proof was the missing technology. In the administrative world that emerged around Uruk by the late 4th millennium BCE, obligations were becoming too numerous, too delayed, and too valuable to rest inside the mind alone. A worker might be owed barley rations at month's end. A herder might deliver animals in one season and receive wool allocations in another. A cultivator might deposit grain under temple authority and expect a recorded claim in return. None of these relationships could remain stable if memory changed with fatigue, status, or fear. The human witness was no longer enough. What civilization needed was an external memory, something visible, countable, preservable within the archive, and difficult to deny once accepted by the institution. That was the real financial barrier at the dawn of history, not the absence of gold, not the absence of markets, the absence of durable proof. And to solve that problem, Sumer did not begin with writing. It began with clay tokens. The first answer was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Long before full writing took shape, people in the ancient Near East were already using formed pieces of clay to count, store, and recall obligations. By roughly 8,000 to 3,500 BCE, this habit of external counting had already laid down one of the deepest foundations of economic memory. In southern Mesopotamia, that made all the difference. A measured quantity no longer had to live only in speech, It could be represented by a small object, shaped, handled, and kept aside for later checking. A quantity of grain, a delivery, a claim, a duty owed to an institution. These could now be separated from the moment in which they were first spoken. That was the quiet breakthrough. Memory had been given a body. Yet these clay counters were only a first solution. They could be scattered, mixed, misplaced, or challenged. And once a city began depending on them, the need was no longer just to count correctly, but to keep each counted promise safely bound to the others. So the record was gathered inward. Instead of leaving these counted objects loose, they could be enclosed inside clay, sealed into a single protected form. Trust changed shape at that moment. What had once been a handful of separate counters became one guarded object, carrying quantity and custody together. The value of such a form was simple and profound. It was harder to alter without leaving a trace, harder to deny once accepted, harder to separate from the authority that sealed it. A city growing in size needed exactly this kind of discipline, not only memory, but controlled memory. Yet the system still carried a burden of its own. If the truth lay hidden inside, then full inspection required breaking the object open. In solving one problem, administration had created another. And from that inconvenience, a quieter and more elegant solution began to emerge on the surface itself. The surface had begun to speak. Once marks pressed into clay could stand for what was being counted, the hidden contents no longer needed to carry the entire burden of proof. A quantity could become a sign. A sign could hold meaning long after the objects themselves were gone. This was the true turning point. Administration was no longer relying only on enclosed evidence, but on visible representation. From about 3500 to 3000 BCE, the earliest two-dimensional signs in Mesopotamia were used chiefly for accounting, and only around 3000 BCE did writing begin to move beyond accounting into fuller language. What mattered at first was not artistic beauty, but consistency. The same sign had to call forth the same quantity, the same good, the same obligation each time it appeared. Out of that discipline, institutional memory grew stronger than personal recollection. And once the sign could endure, the next great need was the hand trained to make it endure correctly. Now the sign needed a keeper. As marks on clay became more regular and more useful, a new human role began to matter more than raw strength in the field: the trained recorder. In the world forming around Uruk, this person did not create wealth with a plow or move it with a boat. He made wealth legible. He gave goods, labor, and obligation a form that institutions could preserve. That was his quiet power. A storehouse could hold grain, but only a disciplined hand could hold the memory of where it came from, to whom it belonged, and what it would later settle. In that sense, the earliest accountant was not merely a writer. He was a guardian of continuity. He turned scattered deliveries into ordered memory, and ordered memory into trust. But once trust began living inside records instead of relationships alone, those records themselves began to change. They no longer described only what had happened. They began to carry value forward. This was the deeper transformation. A mark in clay was no longer only a memory of barley or labor already received. It could stand as a claim that still had force in the future. Once accepted by an institution, the record began to matter almost as much as the goods behind it. Not because clay was precious, but because the claim written upon it could be verified, stored, and enforced. A measured quantity could now outlive the moment of delivery and wait in silence until its value was called upon again. That is when symbols stopped being mere reminders and started behaving like instruments of value. The tablet did not replace the grain. It replaced the need for the grain to be physically present each time value had to be recognized. In that quiet separation, the economy became more abstract, more portable within the archive, and more powerful across time. And once value could be carried by record, one city rose above all others by learning how to organize such records at scale. Uruk. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Uruk had become the great proving ground of organized value. Covering roughly 250 hectares, it was vast by the standards of its age, and later estimates place its population around 3000 BCE in the tens of thousands. But its true importance was not size alone. Uruk brought together temple estates, workshops, storehouses, labor, transport, and administration in one concentrated urban system. Here, value did not move in a simple line from producer to consumer. It circulated through institutions. Grain entered storage, labor left as rations, wool moved into workshops, and goods returned to the record before they moved again into daily life. This was more than a city. It was a machine for making obligations visible. In such a place, writing did not emerge as decoration. It emerged because scale demanded precision. And once Uruk proved that a city could hold thousands of lives together through counted claims, the next great step was inevitable. Those clay marks would have to become faster, sharper, and more exact. The first clay marks were born from pressure, not from leisure. In the great households and temple estates of southern Mesopotamia, growing stores of grain, animals, labor, and rations demanded a record that could be checked again and again without depending on memory alone. So the surface of clay became a place of order. From about 3500 to 3000 BCE, the earliest two-dimensional signs in Mesopotamia were used chiefly for accounting, not yet for the full range of language that writing would later carry. They marked quantities, goods, roles, and distributions. They made the movement of daily life visible. A ration issued, a delivery received, a worker assigned, a storehouse balanced. These were the kinds of realities that first needed signs. Writing did not begin as decoration for culture. It began as discipline for complexity. And once that discipline took hold, the sign itself became more than a mark of control. It became a mirror of the mind that trusted it, feared it, and slowly built a society around it. A spoken promise can be softened by time. A clay record cannot. That difference changed the emotional life of the city. Once an obligation was impressed into wet clay and left to harden, it acquired a strange authority. It no longer belonged only to the two people who remembered it. It belonged to the institution that preserved it. In that shift, trust became heavier. The tablet could reassure because it protected a claim from being forgotten, but it could also unsettle because once a debt or duty entered the archive, it became harder to escape through silence, distance, or denial. The record stood still even when people changed their minds. That was the quiet psychological revolution of early administration. Obligation became visible, durable, and harder to negotiate away. Yet if the tablet was to hold such power over the inner life of a city, one question had to be settled with far greater precision than before. How much was anything actually worth? The first great measure of value did not shine. It grew in the fields. In southern Mesopotamia, barley was more than a crop. It was food, ration, rent, tax, wage, and reckoning all at once. That made it the natural language of everyday value. To count barley was to count survival itself. Over time, this practical world of measures became precise enough to support larger systems of comparison. In later Sumerian accounting tradition, 1 gur of barley was commonly reckoned at 300 selah, and in the Neo-Sumerian period, a well-attested notional standard equated 1 shekel of silver with 1 gur of barley. Behind that ratio stood a profound financial achievement. Value could now be compared across different forms without requiring every exchange to be settled in kind on the spot. The field had become a measuring instrument. But barley, for all its usefulness, was heavy, perishable, and local. And once a civilization learns to measure value clearly, it begins to search for a second measure that can travel farther than the harvest. Barley could measure daily life, but it could not carry the full weight of a growing civilization by itself. It was bulky, perishable, and tied to harvest and storage. So alongside the world of grain, another measure of value gained increasing importance: silver. Not yet as a coin, and not as the everyday money of a crowded street, but as a standard of reckoning. The shekel was first a unit of weight, and silver offered something barley could not: durability, compactness, and a value easier to compare across distance. In administrative life, this changed the scale of thought. A field could still feed a household, but silver allowed larger obligations to be expressed with greater precision and less physical burden. It did not replace grain in ordinary existence. It stood beside it, giving the economy a second language. And once a society can speak value in both grain and silver, it begins to imagine something even more powerful than payment itself: settlement by record alone. The remarkable truth is that a sophisticated economy does not need coins in order to think financially. In Mesopotamia, value could be calculated, compared, owed, and settled long before a stamped piece of metal became necessary. Once grain and silver had both become standards of reckoning, a tablet could do more than remember a delivery. It could preserve a balance. A claim could move through the institution without barley being poured out each time, and without silver changing hands at every step. The record itself held the relationship in place. This did not make the system unreal, it made it efficient. Goods still existed, labor still mattered, and harvests still failed or succeeded in the real world. But the movement of value no longer had to mirror the movement of objects at every moment. In that quiet separation lay one of the oldest financial truths in history. Money is strongest not when it shines, but when a society agrees to recognize it without touching it. At the center of this system stood the temple, not as a modern bank in disguise, but as a powerful institution of storage, labor, accounting, and authority. Its granaries gathered surplus, its workshops transformed raw material, its officials recorded deliveries, obligations, and distributions with a discipline no household could match on its own. This is why the temple mattered so deeply to economic life. It was one of the places where memory became administrative, where value became legible, and where obligation could be preserved beyond the life of any single witness. Yet the temple's power was not unlimited and not identical to a state treasury in the modern sense. Its strength was local, rooted in land, labor, storehouses, and the trust commanded by institutions that endured. In the quiet rooms where these records were kept, wealth was no longer just grown or carried. It was organized. And once wealth is organized at that scale, the next challenge is no longer how to store it, but how to trace its movement with precision. Once wealth could be stored, measured, and claimed, a city faced a harder task than accumulation: movement. Grain did not simply exist in Uruk. It entered, waited, departed, returned, and changed form. Wool became thread, thread became cloth, cloth became obligation fulfilled somewhere else. Labor was issued in rations, rations sustained work, and work produced the next cycle of entries. What made the record so powerful was that it could follow this invisible motion without requiring every eye to see every step. The tablet gave continuity to movement. It allowed institutions to remember not just what they possessed, but where value had come from, where it was meant to go, and what remained unsettled in between. In that sense, accounting became more than storage. It became a way of tracing life as it moved through the city. And once movement can be traced, The question is no longer only economic. It becomes moral as well. In Mesopotamia, administration and the sacred world stood much closer together than they do in the modern imagination. The same institutions that received offerings, managed land, and organized labor also preserved records of what was due, delivered, and distributed. That closeness gave the tablet an authority deeper than convenience. A record kept under institutional protection was not merely useful. It carried weight because it belonged to an ordered world that people were expected to respect. The archive, the granary, the workshop, and the temple court were not separate universes. They touched one another. That is why an obligation recorded in clay could feel heavier than a spoken agreement between neighbors. It stood inside a larger structure of order. The city could now preserve duty outside the human body, and once duty is preserved that way, it demands something more exact than memory or reverence alone. It demands number. Number gave the system its calm precision. In ancient Mesopotamia, the sexagesimal tradition, the counting logic built around 60, proved extraordinarily useful because 60 could be divided cleanly into many smaller parts. For administration, that flexibility mattered. It allowed grain, labor, land, and time to be broken into shares with far less friction than a cruder system would allow. Over time, this mathematical habit would leave a mark far beyond the archive. We still divide the hour into 60 minutes, and the circle into 360 degrees, quiet echoes of an old Mesopotamian way of ordering the world. But in Uruk and its successors, the first power of this system was not cosmic wonder. It was administrative clarity. A civilization trying to hold obligations steady across seasons needed a way to divide without losing proportion. And once number could do that with elegance, the next step was inevitable. Time itself would begin to enter the ledger as a measurable force. Once number brought order to quantity, it was only natural that time would follow. In the agrarian world of southern Mesopotamia, value was never detached from season. Grain ripened by the cycle of the fields, labor followed irrigation and harvest, and obligations matured across intervals that could not be left vague forever. A delivery made now might be settled later. A ration issued in one month might answer for work done in another. In such a society, wealth was not only counted, it was timed. This was the deeper achievement of early administration. It gave duration a place beside quantity. A claim no longer meant only how much, it also implied when. And once a system begins tying value to measured intervals, patience itself becomes economic. But if time could now shape obligation, then one more challenge became unavoidable. A claim measured across months or seasons would have to be trusted even when the original moment had long passed from sight. Trust over time required more than a mark. It required a way to confirm that the mark had not been altered, misread, or falsely claimed. That is why the Mesopotamian record became not only a memory aid, but a protected object. Seals, sealed containers, written surfaces, and stored copies all served one quiet purpose: to make later doubt harder to sustain. Verification in this early world was not elegant in the modern sense, but it was disciplined. A record could be checked against its seal. A claim could be brought back before authority. A document could survive long enough to outlast the changing voice of a witness. This mattered because the larger the institution grew, the more often trust had to travel farther than personal familiarity. The city could not depend forever on face-to-face certainty. It needed forms that could carry confidence across absence. And once confidence can survive absence, something even more remarkable becomes possible. A society can begin trusting value without needing coinage at all. That is the truth modern eyes often miss. A civilization does not need coins in its pocket to possess money in a deeper sense. It needs standards, records, institutions, and enough shared confidence for claims to be recognized over time. Mesopotamia had all of these long before the clang of struck metal entered history. Barley could measure daily value. Silver could express larger reckonings. Tablets and seals could preserve memory beyond the reach of speech. And institutions could hold those relationships together. This did not make the system simple. It made it remarkably sophisticated for a world without coinage. Money, in its oldest durable form, was already living as a structure of trust before it ever became a stamped object. Yet a system built on trust without coinage also opened the door to a new and dangerous power. If value could be recognized before goods changed hands, then people could begin living not only on what they possessed, but on what they expected to receive. Once value could be recognized without coinage, a deeper possibility appeared. A person no longer had to possess everything at the moment of exchange. He only needed a claim that an institution or another party would accept across time. That was the quiet birth of credit. In the world of southern Mesopotamia, this could take the form of grain advanced before harvest, silver owed against a future settlement, or obligations recorded now and answered later. Credit did not erase scarcity. It rearranged it. It allowed the present to lean upon the future. A field could be planted before its yield existed. Labor could be sustained before its product was finished. Trade could move before final balance had been physically settled. In that sense, credit was not a luxury added to the economy. It was one of the ways the economy learned to breathe. But the moment a society begins drawing value forward from time not yet lived, it also invites danger. Not every future arrives as promised. In an agricultural world, credit was always exposed to forces no tablet could command. Flood, drought, blight, war, and disorder could tear through the future on which a claim depended. That is why debt in Mesopotamia was never a purely private matter. When crops failed badly enough, insolvency did not remain inside one household. It spread outward into labor, family, and public order. A society built on obligations had to reckon with the fact that nature did not honor every schedule humans imposed upon it. This was the hard lesson behind early risk. A claim might be recorded with precision, yet the world that was meant to satisfy it could still fracture. The ledger could remember, but it could not make the rains arrive. And when enough failures gathered at once, the problem ceased to be one of individual disappointment. It became a civic danger. That is when debt begins to sort human beings into unequal fates. Debt does not fall evenly upon a city. Those who hold reserves, land, or institutional backing can wait. Those who live close to the edge cannot. That imbalance gave credit its darker social force. In Mesopotamia, insolvency could lead not only to loss of property, but to debt bondage, imprisonment for debt, or even the sale of children and of the debtor's own person in later legal traditions. The record that once protected order could now deepen hierarchy. A bad season for one household might become an opportunity for another to absorb land, labor, or dependence. This is how debt moves beyond arithmetic and enters the structure of society itself. It determines who remains free, who becomes vulnerable, and whose future is spent before it fully arrives. By this point, the ledger had ceased to be only a memory of exchange. It had become a machine that could concentrate power. And once power begins feeding on unpaid obligations, a civilization must decide whether every debt should always be collected in full. The ledger had done something extraordinary. It allowed value to be remembered, moved, compared, and trusted without coinage. It gave cities scale, institutions continuity, and obligations a durable form. But every system that preserves value also preserves pressure. A claim written clearly can survive far longer than the harvest that was supposed to answer it. A balance can remain standing even after the field has failed, the flock has thinned, or the household has weakened. That was the darker truth waiting inside administrative success. The record did not merely protect order, it could also prolong burden. The more exact the tablet became, the less easily a debt dissolved into forgetfulness. And once obligation can be carried forward with such precision, one new idea begins to take hold with dangerous elegance. Value is no longer expected only to return. It is expected to return with growth. At first, the idea would have seemed almost natural. In an agricultural world, wealth did not always stand still. Herds reproduced, seed returned as harvest. A quantity entrusted in one season could, under favorable conditions, come back enlarged in another. From that experience, the mind could easily take one more step. If wealth can grow in nature, perhaps an obligation can grow in the ledger as well. This was the quiet conceptual shift at the heart of interest. Time no longer merely delayed repayment. Time itself began to acquire a price. What had once been a neutral interval between delivery and settlement now became a measured source of gain. That is why interest belongs to a deeper history than coinage. It emerges when a society becomes confident enough in records, standards, and future expectations to ask not only whether value will return, but how much more it should return for having been absent. Yet the resemblance between natural growth and financial growth concealed a profound difference. A field can fail, a flock can sicken, a season can disappoint. Nature expands, but only within limits. The ledger, by contrast, can remain exact even when the world that must satisfy it becomes unstable. This is where interest begins to change character. What first appears to imitate life can slowly detach from life. A quantity owed in grain or silver may continue to grow on the tablet even when the household that owes it is moving in the opposite direction. By the historical periods for which our evidence is strongest, Mesopotamian practice shows standard interest rates of about 20% on silver loans and roughly 1/3 on barley loans. Those are not small additions. They mark the moment when time itself had been disciplined into arithmetic. And once arithmetic learns to grow faster than recovery, debt ceases to be only a bridge. It becomes a trap. Once interest enters the record, debt changes its rhythm. It no longer waits passively for repayment. It begins to grow while the debtor waits, works, and worries. This was the unsettling power hidden inside a measured obligation. A missed season did not simply delay settlement, it could enlarge what remained unpaid. In such a world, time ceased to be neutral. Each interval carried the possibility that the gap between what was owed and what could actually be produced would widen rather than narrow. That is why interest transformed the moral atmosphere of debt. What had once been a burden tied to one exchange could now become a moving burden, gathering weight while nothing visible seemed to happen at all. The field might still be empty, the harvest might still not have arrived, yet on the tablet, the obligation was already becoming larger. And once a society accepts that silent growth, prosperity and danger begin to spring from the same seed. That is the paradox at the heart of credit. The same advance that makes planting possible can also make failure more dangerous. Seed grain can open the next harvest, yet if the harvest disappoints, the very loan that once promised renewal begins to tighten like a cord. Prosperity and debt are not enemies at the beginning, they are twins. One looks toward growth, the other waits to claim part of whatever growth appears. In a stable year, this arrangement can seem almost elegant. The future arrives, the obligation is met, and the system appears wise. But ancient life rarely moved in straight lines. A flood, a weak yield, a family crisis, or political disturbance could interrupt the chain between advance and return. Then, the same mechanism that had enabled production became an instrument of pressure. That is why the history of finance begins not only with abundance, but with the danger that abundance will be claimed twice, once by nature and once by the creditor. At this point, debt ceases to be merely personal and begins to reveal its arithmetic. In the historical periods where our evidence is clearest, Mesopotamian lending commonly worked with standard rates of about 20% on silver and about 1/3 on barley. Those numbers are not abstractions. They describe the pace at which pressure could accumulate when repayment failed to keep pace. A household producing too little could not negotiate with arithmetic the way it might negotiate with a neighbor's mood. The tablet remained exact. The rate remained exact. What varied was the human capacity to bear it. This is the moment when finance shows its coldest face. The system does not need cruelty in its language to become severe in its effects. Number alone can do that. And once a civilization begins to feel the force of fixed rates pressing upon unstable lives, the question before ruler and society can no longer be postponed. When does a lawful debt become a threat to the social order itself? By the time our evidence becomes clearer, interest was no longer an occasional improvisation. It had become a recognized habit of the system. In Mesopotamian practice, loans in silver commonly carried a standard rate of about 20%, while loans in barley often stood at roughly 1/3. These were not random figures. They gave expectation a fixed shape. Lender and borrower entered the future already knowing that time would not pass for free. That certainty made calculation easier, but it also made pressure more regular. Once a rate becomes standard, hardship no longer needs cruelty to become severe. The burden can arise simply because the numbers continue to behave exactly as agreed. That is the cold elegance of an organized credit system. It does not need chaos to produce suffering. It only needs time, weak harvests, and an obligation that has already learned how to grow. A crop answers to weather, soil, labor, water, insects, disease, and chance. Debt answers to arithmetic. That difference explains almost everything. The field can fail without permission. The flock can thin for reasons no household controls. But the tablet does not tire, hesitate, or lower its demand simply because the world has become less generous. Where nature moves unevenly, number moves with terrible consistency. A household may recover slowly after a poor season, yet the obligation recorded against it can continue advancing at its fixed pace. This is why debt can outrun production, even in a society built on agriculture. The harvest must struggle through uncertainty before it appears. The debt needs only time. And when time favors the ledger more faithfully than it favors the field, the balance between livelihood and obligation begins to break. That is the hidden geometry of crisis. A family can work harder and still find the distance widening. The trap does not spring in one dramatic instant. It closes slowly. A poor harvest leads to delay. Delay enlarges the balance. The enlarged balance demands more of the next season. The next season then begins already burdened by the one before it. This is how debt changes from a bridge into a structure of confinement. The borrower is no longer using time to recover. He is using time merely to remain behind. In such a condition, even honest labor can lose its power to restore freedom. The household works, pays, borrows again, and watches the future shrink. What makes this tragic is that the mechanism is lawful, legible, and often socially accepted. Nothing about it needs to look chaotic from the outside. Yet inside the household, the experience is suffocating. The credit system that once expanded possibility now narrows it. And when enough families begin living inside that narrowing, private debt ceases to remain private at all. When debt outruns recovery, freedom itself begins to narrow. In the Mesopotamian world, insolvency was not only a matter of unpaid balance, it could become a matter of status. A household unable to satisfy its obligations might lose control over land, labor, or even the bodies that sustained both. That is the point at which debt stops being a financial condition and becomes a human one. The tablet still appears calm, the numbers still appear lawful, yet behind that quiet surface, a family may already be crossing the threshold from temporary hardship into dependency. This is why debt bondage belongs to the deepest history of finance. A recorded obligation can reach into the structure of life itself, turning time, work, and vulnerability into forms of collateral. And once a society allows debt to press upon the person rather than only upon property, the next loss is rarely suffered by the debtor alone. The family is where an economic crisis first becomes visible. A failed household balance does not remain trapped inside abstraction for long. It enters meals, marriages, inheritance, and the fragile arrangements by which one generation protects the next. In Mesopotamian legal tradition, debt could reach so deeply that children might be sold, and the debtor's own person could also be drawn into the logic of repayment. That is the moment when finance reveals its most intimate violence. The burden no longer sits only on fields, flocks, or stores. It enters the house. It changes what parents can promise, what children can expect, and how long dignity can be defended against necessity. Once debt reaches the family in that way, society begins to consume its own foundation. And when enough households begin to weaken at once, the problem can no longer be left to creditors and debtors alone. It rises to the level of rule itself. That was the ruler's burden in the ancient Near East. A kingdom could not remain stable if too many free households were slowly being reduced to dependency. Debt was not merely a private contract. At a certain scale, it became a threat to labor, military service, tax capacity, and social peace. This is why Mesopotamian kings later issued proclamations of debt release. These acts did not arise from sentiment alone. They were political judgments about survival. Royal clean slates could accompany famine, external danger, or the opening of a new reign as a deliberate act of restoration. The logic was stark. If the weight of old obligations became too great, the state itself could weaken. A ruler who wished to preserve order sometimes had to break the arithmetic in order to save the society that arithmetic was destroying. And once that possibility appears, the history of debt enters a new phase: cancellation. When pressure became too heavy, the ancient Near East did not always answer with stricter collection. Sometimes it answered with release. In the Sumerian world, later tradition preserves the memory of acts that restored people from burdens that had begun to threaten the fabric of society itself. The most powerful idea inside such acts was simple. A kingdom could not remain healthy if too many of its households were trapped beneath obligations they could no longer carry. Debt had to be limited before it consumed the people on whom the state depended. This is why the language of release in Mesopotamian history feels so striking. It was never only about mercy, it was about restoration. A society had reached the point where arithmetic alone could no longer be trusted to preserve order. And once release enters the political imagination, debt is no longer a private weight alone. It becomes something a ruler may have to cut away in order to keep the whole body alive. A debt release was more than a gesture. It was a reset of social breathing space. In Mesopotamian history, royal proclamations could suspend or cancel certain debts, release persons reduced to dependency, and restore the conditions under which households could stand on their own again. That is what made these acts so consequential. They acknowledged a truth that every mature credit system eventually discovers. not every lawful claim can be enforced forever without damaging the society that gave the law its force in the first place. The ruler's task, then, was not simply to defend contracts at all costs. It was to decide when preserving the future required interrupting the past. This is why a debt reset belongs within the history of finance, not outside it. It was not the opposite of the system. It was one of the emergency tools by which the system saved itself. Yet such relief could never remain an answer forever. If debt had to be cut once, the harder question was why it would need to be cut again. That repetition reveals the deeper logic. Debt relief was not meaningful because debt existed once. It was meaningful because debt tended to accumulate again. Agriculture, hierarchy, fixed obligations, and unequal resilience kept producing the same pressure in new forms. So the logic of release was cyclical, not accidental. A ruler intervened because the credit system, left entirely to its own arithmetic, could harden into a threat against the free population, the productive base, and the political order together. This is the ancient lesson hidden beneath later ideas of Jubilee. Cancellation was not a denial of economic reality. It was a recognition of it. There are moments when strict continuity destroys the very continuity a state is trying to preserve. At that point, interruption becomes a form of wisdom. And once a civilization learns that lesson, it must also confront the darker one standing behind it. If law must repeatedly repair debt, then law itself will have to change. A society cannot live forever beneath the logic of absolute collection. If every claim is enforced to its furthest limit, there comes a point at which the victories of creditors begin to hollow out the very world on which credit depends. Fields lose free cultivators. Households lose resilience. The state loses labor, taxes, and loyal men who might otherwise serve in peace and war. That is why the deepest conflict in the history of debt is not between kindness and discipline. It is between arithmetic and stability. A lawful obligation may still become socially destructive when its weight begins to exceed the carrying power of the community around it. Mesopotamian rulers understood this with painful clarity. They did not always choose release because debt was unreal. They chose it because the collapse threatened to become real on a larger scale than any tablet could contain. And once that truth is recognized, finance can no longer remain only a matter of accounts. It becomes a matter of law. The language was ancient, but the logic feels familiar even now. When a debt system threatens to destroy the productive life it was meant to organize, some form of interruption becomes necessary. Mesopotamian debt releases were not bankruptcy law in the modern technical sense, and they should not be described that way too literally. Yet they do stand as a distant ancestor to a later legal insight. There are moments when a society must decide that preserving future viability matters more than extracting every last payment from the past. This is a profound financial idea. It says that order is not maintained by enforcing every claim forever, but by deciding which claims can be carried without breaking the system that must carry them. In that sense, debt relief was not the failure of law. It was law discovering a limit inside finance itself. And once law discovers a limit, it begins to write that limit down. That is how the story must now turn. For centuries, obligation had grown from memory into record, from record into credit, and from credit into crisis. Kings could intervene when collapse threatened, but intervention alone was not enough. A civilization this dense, this literate, and this dependent on stored obligations would eventually need more than occasional rescue. It would need rules. It would need recognized procedures, named penalties, visible standards, and written judgments that could stand beyond the life of a single ruler. Debt had revealed the problem. Now law would attempt to contain it. The tablet that once counted grain would begin to speak in another voice, not only what was owed, but what was permitted, forbidden, compensated, or enforced. And once the chaos of obligation begins to harden into written order, one name rises from the dust with unusual clarity: Ur-Nammu. In the middle of the 21st century BCE, under Ur-Nammu of Ur, Mesopotamia left behind one of the oldest surviving law codes known to history. This matters not because it solved every problem, but because it marked a decisive shift in how civilization chose to face them. Obligation was no longer to be handled only through custom, memory, or ad hoc royal reaction. It would be named, structured, and written into a visible legal world. The code associated with Ur-Nammu dealt with matters such as bodily injury, the flight of slaves, and other ordered responses to disorder. That is the point at which finance and law meet in their deepest historical form. A society built on stored value and recorded obligation had finally begun to build an equally durable framework for consequences. The question was no longer simply who owed what. It was now also what the law would do when order had been broken. Once law was written, ownership itself became steadier in the eyes of the city. Land, houses, labor, inheritance, and exchange could now stand inside a framework broader than custom alone. What had once depended heavily on memory, status, or local recognition could increasingly be tied to named persons, described objects, and recorded claims. This did not create a modern world of private property overnight, nor did it erase dispute, but it did change the texture of order. Property was no longer only what a family held, it was also what a legal world could recognize, defend, or transfer. That shift matters deeply in the history of finance. Wealth grows more powerful when it can be identified clearly, and more dangerous when its loss can be enforced with equal clarity. And once ownership becomes legible in that way, the ledger itself begins to change. It is no longer just a store of memory. It becomes part of the legal architecture of possession. This was the next great transformation of clay. A record was no longer valuable only because it helped an institution remember. It was valuable because it could stand inside a legal process. A tablet could now support a claim, anchor a dispute, and survive beyond the uncertainty of living witnesses. The written record did not replace judgment, but it gave judgment a firmer ground on which to stand. In that sense, the ledger entered a second life. It ceased to be merely administrative and became increasingly juridical. The marks in clay no longer said only what had been delivered, counted, or owed. They could now help decide what was binding, what was violated, and what consequence should follow. Once that happens, writing stops being only a technology of order. It becomes a technology of authority. And once authority speaks through the record, obligation can no longer remain a matter of memory alone. It becomes something the law can reach. Law acquires its hardest edge when obligation is no longer merely recognized, but enforced. In Mesopotamian tradition, insolvency could lead to imprisonment for debt, slavery by mortgage, and even the sale of children or of the debtor's own person. Those consequences reveal what enforcement meant in its most severe form. A lawful claim was not simply a number waiting patiently on clay. It could press outward into land, labor, household, and body. This is why the history of debt cannot be separated from the history of power. The stronger the legal world became, the more clearly society had to confront the cost of letting obligation travel all the way to the human person. Enforcement gave the ledger its teeth, but it also exposed the danger that those teeth might bite too deeply. And once a civilization recognizes that danger, it must ask a new question. How can a claim be made secure without allowing fraud, disguise, or denial to dissolve the system from within? Before ink signatures, there was the rolling seal. In Mesopotamia, a small carved cylinder could be rolled across wet clay to leave behind a repeated image that identified authority, ownership, or responsibility. When impressed on tablets or tablet cases, Such seals helped show who stood behind what had been written. When pressed into clay used to secure jars, containers, or doors, they helped protect goods against unauthorized opening. This gave the record a second layer of confidence. A written claim could now be joined to a visible mark of identity and control. The seal did not eliminate dishonesty, but it narrowed the space in which denial could live. It turned authority into image, and image into proof. And once proof begins to carry a personal mark, the legal world moves one step closer to a deeper question. Who exactly is responsible for the obligation that stands on the tablet? A financial system grows stronger when obligation can be attached not only to quantities, but to persons. That was one of the great powers of seals and written records together. They helped bind transactions to recognizable identities. In Mesopotamia, this mattered because value was moving through institutions, households, workshops, and storage systems that could no longer rely on simple face-to-face memory. Responsibility had to become legible. A person, an office, a household, or an authority needed to be knowable in relation to what was owned, delivered, secured, or owed. This is where finance becomes inseparable from identity. The question is no longer only what happened or how much was transferred. It is who can be called upon when a claim is challenged. And once a civilization learns to tie responsibility to recorded identity, it creates a new kind of social power: the ability to hold strangers to an order they cannot easily deny. By now, the tablet, the seal, and the law had created a world too complex for casual literacy. The system needed trained hands. In Mesopotamia, scribes formed a professional class whose education was practical and demanding, extending from reading and writing into law and other learned subjects. Student tablets show how scribes were trained by copying forms repeatedly, learning signs until accuracy became habit. That training made them more than writers. It made them gatekeepers of intelligibility. They stood between spoken life and recorded order, between everyday transaction and institutional memory. A harvest, a contract, a penalty, a ration list, a legal claim, all had to pass through the discipline of their hands to enter the durable world of the archive. And once knowledge is concentrated in that way, another force quietly enters the system beside law and debt: asymmetry. Once records, seals, and legal forms gathered inside institutions, knowledge no longer lay evenly across society. Some people knew how to read claims, trace obligations, and understand what a mark in clay truly meant. Others stood before the same tablet and could only feel its weight without mastering its language. That imbalance created a quieter form of power than force, but often a deeper one. In a city where value increasingly moved through records, those who could interpret the record stood closer to the center of reality itself. Information had become unequal, not because truth was hidden in darkness, but because truth was being stored in forms that only some could fully command. This is where bureaucracy begins to acquire its special strength. A society can be ruled not only by weapons or wealth, but by unequal access to what is legible. And once that inequality hardens, administration itself begins to act like an engine. That engine did not run on abstraction alone. It ran on storehouses, rations, workshops, land assignments, labor lists, and archives that could preserve continuity from one cycle to the next. Mesopotamian institutions had learned to make administration durable. Grain could be received, redistributed, and recorded. Goods could be secured. Duties could be assigned. Claims could be preserved beyond the memory of any single witness. This is why bureaucracy mattered so much in the ancient city. It turned scattered effort into repeatable order. It allowed a large society to keep functioning even when most of its members did not directly know one another. In that sense, bureaucracy was not merely a burden placed upon economic life. It was one of the instruments by which economic life became scalable. But once a machine for organizing people and goods reaches that degree of reach, one final question emerges with enormous force. How does power draw resources back out of the society it has learned to measure so well? Measurement always invites extraction. Once a state or temple-centered institution can count land, labor, grain, and obligation with confidence, it can also claim a portion of them with greater regularity. In Mesopotamia, large institutions were deeply involved in collecting, storing, and redistributing surplus, and that made administration inseparable from the drawing in of resources. What entered the granary, the workshop, or the archive did not arrive there by accident. It arrived through a system able to define what was due and to preserve that definition in durable form. This is the financial consequence of record-keeping at scale. Power no longer waits passively for gifts or uncertain tribute. It learns to identify, assess, and call resources inward. Yet every act of organized extraction carries a danger. The more successfully a system counts and claims, the more fragile it becomes if legitimacy begins to fail. And once legitimacy wavers, the story of clay and law begins to approach its limit. By now, clay had done far more than preserve grain counts. It had become a medium through which a civilization organized property, obligation, identity, and consequence. That is the lasting legacy of Mesopotamian law. It did not create the modern world in any simple or direct way, but it established something more enduring: the habit of writing social order down. Contracts, penalties, ownership, injury, debt, and status could all be carried into a durable record rather than left to vanish into memory. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, cuneiform was already serving a vast array of economic, religious, political, literary, and scholarly purposes, showing how far this written world had expanded beyond its earliest administrative roots. Law, then, was not an isolated invention. It was part of a larger civilizational decision to make order visible, preservable, and transmissible across time. Yet every strength that clay gave to memory also created a shadow. What could be recorded so well in one place could remain stubbornly bound to that place, and that would become the next great problem. For centuries, clay had served almost every need a growing civilization could name. It could remember, it could verify, it could support authority, it could outlast the voice of a witness and the reign of a king. In the quiet rooms of the archive, it must have seemed nearly eternal. Yet no medium solves history forever. A record preserved in clay remains powerful only so long as it can be stored, protected, retrieved, interpreted, and carried within the institutional world that gives it meaning. The very solidity that made clay trustworthy also made it heavy, local, and dependent on place. It excelled at preserving order within a concentrated system of granaries, temples, workshops, and courts. But beyond that protected world, its strengths began to reveal their opposite. This is how a civilization reaches maturity, not when its tools become perfect, but when their limits begin to show. And once the limit of clay comes into view, memory itself starts to feel heavy. That weight was not only physical, though clay was certainly never light, it was institutional. A record stored in one archive, guarded by one authority, and legible only within one trained system, carried a form of memory that was durable, but not effortlessly mobile. This mattered more as societies grew, trade stretched farther, and value increasingly had to travel beyond the walls that first taught it how to be measured. A tablet could preserve a claim beautifully, but it did not move through distance with the ease of a spoken rumor, let alone a later coin. It required place, handling, and context. In that sense, the brilliance of the clay system contained the seed of its own limitation. It could make trust deep, but not easily universal. And once a civilization begins to need trust that can travel farther than the archive, it starts to search for something that can carry value with less weight than memory itself. A clay record could preserve value with remarkable depth, but it could not carry value with equal ease. That was the next great limit. A tablet belonged to an archive, a seal belonged to an authority, and both drew much of their power from the institutional world around them. The farther value needed to travel from that world, the more fragile its certainty became. A claim stored in one city was not the same as a value easily recognized in another. Clay could move, of course, but not with the lightness, speed, or immediate legibility that wider exchange would eventually demand. The system remained brilliant within its own architecture, yet its brilliance was anchored to place. And as trade stretched farther and societies grew more connected, that anchoring began to feel less like stability and more like friction. A civilization that wants value to travel farther will eventually begin to desire a medium that travels more easily than the archive itself. But portability was not the only problem. The moment value depends on signs, marks, and recognized authority, it also becomes vulnerable to imitation, concealment, and dispute. Mesopotamia understood this deeply. That is why seals were impressed on tablets, tablet cases, jars, and doors, not as decoration, but as a defense against unauthorized access and false claims. A system built on records must always fear the shadow version of itself, the forged mark, the broken seal, the denied obligation, the claim whose authority is no longer clear. This is the hidden anxiety inside every world of symbolic value. The more a society depends on signs to secure trust, the more urgently it must ask how those signs will remain believable when they move beyond immediate supervision. And once that anxiety becomes strong enough, the search for a more universally recognizable proof of value begins to intensify. That search would eventually turn toward metal. Not because clay had failed to think, but because metal could promise something clay could not. Value condensed into a form easier to carry, divide, test, and recognize across distance. Long before true coinage, societies had already understood the attraction of precious metal as a durable store of worth. But standardized, certified coinage did not arrive until much later, and the turning point is generally associated with Lydia in the 7th century BCE. What matters here is the longing that came before the coin itself. A civilization had already learned that trust could be written, sealed, and archived. Now it was beginning to desire trust that could travel in the hand. That desire did not erase the old world of records. It rose out of its limits, and as the weight of clay gives way, in imagination, to the gleam of metal, the story prepares to leave the river mud of Sumer for a new experiment in value, one that will roar with the image of a lion. So the story begins to leave the river plain. For thousands of years, value had been pressed into earth, counted in grain, weighed in silver, sealed in clay, and preserved in archives that taught cities how to trust. Nothing about that achievement was small. It built the administrative imagination of civilization itself. Yet Earth could hold value more easily than it could send value far. The archive could preserve trust more easily than it could make trust instantly legible across distance. And so, slowly, history leaned toward another experiment. Not away from record, but away from dependence on record alone. What had once been written into mud would now begin seeking a harder, brighter body, something that could carry recognized worth in the hand, not only in the archive. That is why the next chapter belongs not to the scribe, but to the furnace, not to the granary, but to the stamp, not to the river mud of Sumer, but to the firelit workshops of Lydia. Before money became a coin, it was already a promise, a measurement, a record, a claim, and a discipline. Sumer taught humanity that value does not begin with metal. It begins when memory becomes external, when obligation becomes visible, and when trust can survive the voice that first spoke it. In wet clay, the ancient world discovered that wealth could be organized before it could be minted. That is the true beginning of finance. Yet every beginning carries its own limit. A system that could remember so deeply could not yet travel lightly enough for the wider world that was coming. And in that unresolved desire for value that could be trusted, carried, recognized, and exchanged more easily across distance, the next great transformation was already waiting. In Lydia, centuries later, that desire would take a new form. Metal struck with authority, weight certified by power, value made portable beneath the image of a lion. And when that lion finally roars, the age of clay will not disappear. It will evolve.